Before introducing Melissa, I just wanted to say something about why we wanted to hold this training. A story surfaced recently at our meeting having to do with the Underground Railroad. One of the people who is a member of our meeting was told when he was a very young person helping out on some of the meeting property issues, he was told by a man who was, I think at that point, 93 years of age, who had actually known some of the members of the meeting who had been active in the Underground Railroad. There was a station master, Peter Mott. Some of you may have visited the Mott house here. At any rate, this older gentleman told this young man that he had known some of the people who were part of the Underground Railroad, and that even as late as the early 1900s, or more than 40 years after the Underground Railroad ended, these people were still afraid to say anything about the role that they had played or provide any details or stories about their experiences. They were afraid that if they revealed the roles they had played, it would damage our meeting. And so any details of what they did went with them to their grave. And right now, we would love to know some of those details. People are constantly asking, well, we know, something was happening. What was it? And so we want to make sure that the stories of this generation are saved. Many friends were involved in important movements, the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement in terms of Vietnam, as well as some of the Middle East wars. People were involved in the women's movement. Some friends were amongst this first generation of people who are able to have same-sex marriages. We've got others who supported or assisted new refugees, people who are involved in supporting people in the criminal justice system, and so on and so on. So there's a lot of wonderful stories. And so we're so glad that you're able to be with us, and thinking also about stories of people that you know who were the stories we really like to be able to save them. And our intent is that these stories should be saved for the person's family, for the meeting. Perhaps some people will feel comfortable sharing transcripts with the Quaker archives in Haverford and Swarthmore, and perhaps even video the interviews and allow us to post them on the South Jersey Quaker YouTube channel. So this is sort of our goal. As I mentioned in the email coming out to everyone, Melissa will now take over for most of the rest of the time. And about 11:15, we'll draw the conversation to a close, and then talk a little bit about, for the Quakers and wanting to collect Quaker stories, some of the logistics and some of the ideas for that. So at that point, our guests who are not part of the Friends community are welcome to stay with us, but we'll separate that topic until we'll save that till the end. So let me formally introduce Melissa. We're so pleased to have you. Melissa is a specialist professor of public history with the Department of History and Anthropology at Monmouth College. And you may have seen in the promotional materials, she's also president of the oral history in the Middle Atlantic region. She's editor of the New Jersey Studies and Interdisciplinary Journal. This is a joint venture of the New Jersey Historical Commission, the Rutgers University Libraries, and Monmouth University. And so please join me in welcoming Melissa, and we're looking forward to hearing more about doing oral history. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Let me share my screen. I will ask you for your patience and grace today as I attempt to navigate all of the technology, right? got a lot of audio clips and such that I'd like to show you, and hopefully all will go smoothly, even in this virtual format. So thank you so much, Linda, for having me today and for becoming an institutional member of oral history in the Mid-Atlantic region. I really just want to thank Linda too for her thoughtfulness in her diligence in helping to plan today's event, and applaud her for opening this to the public. It was lovely of you to do that service for the community. So, Linda told you a little bit about my background. I have been doing oral history since 2002, 2003. I was trained in oral history as an undergrad, and then went on to first run oral history projects for the Army when I was the command historian for the U.S. Army Communications Electronics Command at Fort Monmouth. And now I work on a variety of projects, as you'll see today. Just a few quick notes in advance of our starting. This is a very, very basic workshop. You could take, an intense weekend long workshop. You could take a semester long oral history class, like I'm teaching at Monmouth right now. You go to Columbia University and get an entire master's degree just in oral history, right? But with the basics that we cover today and the resources I am going to give you for further research on your own, I am very confident that you can do some very, very nice interviewing on your own and really create some useful resources for the historical record. I'd also like to note, there are some things, as with any field, that oral historians disagree on, right? Should you interview audio only or video, for example? And we'll talk about some of these matters of opinion throughout the course of today. I would say just remember, in the end, the most important thing is always that you just approach this work slowly, thoughtfully, deliberately, and in the spirit of partnership between the interviewer and the interviewee or narrator. We are going to have question and answer at the end, but I deal with students all day. Nothing you can do is going to throw me. So if at any point you want to unmute yourself and shout out a question, if you don't want to wait till the end, that's fine. So what's our agenda? We've gotten through some introductions. We're going to look at defining oral history versus other forms of interviewing. We're going to look at a brief history of oral history. We're going to explore some existing oral history collections, because I think having an understanding of what's out there will really help you with your techniques and your practices. We'll take a brief stretch break, fill up that coffee, whatever you need to do, and then we'll come back and really get into the nitty-gritty of oral history, best practices, procedures, and resources. So, all right, what is oral history? As far as oral historians are concerned, at least, oral history has a very specific definition. It's not just any verbal testimony, and doing oral history and doing it well is not just as simple as sitting down and hitting record. It's not rocket science, but it's not as simple as just sitting down and hitting record. According to the Oral History Association, the premier national professional development organization for oral historians in the United States, oral history is a field of study and a method of gathering, preserving, and interpreting the voices and memories of people, communities, and participants in past events. Oral history is both the oldest type of historical inquiry, predating the written word, and one of the most modern, now using 21st century technologies, which we'll be talking about more today. In doing oral history, this very simple soup to nuts book that I highly recommend, author Donald Ritchie, a past president of OMAR, I might add, explains oral history collects memories and personal commentaries of historical significance through recorded interviews. An oral history interview generally consists of a well-prepared interviewer questioning an interviewee and recording their exchange in audio or video format. Recordings of the interview are often transcribed, summarized, or indexed, and placed in a library or archives. These interviews may be used for research or excerpted in publication, radio, video documentary, museum exhibitions, etc., etc. But the capturing is what it's at the heart of oral history. At its heart, oral history is really a conversation, right? It's not an interrogation, it's not a deposition, it is a conversation. Its primary goal is the preservation of stories for the historical record. It's not all about getting clicks or views, right? Or finding those snappy sound bites like we might expect from, certain types of news interviewing or say podcasts. In oral history, we're not doing multiple takes. We're not doing edits, right? It's about capturing these long form stories in their purest form. So that's kind of the formal modern definition of oral history. But I should note, of course, that this term, right, oral histories and spoken history has historically been used a number of ways. I mean, it can be used colloquially a lot of different ways. It could be used to refer to formal, rehearsed accounts of the past presented by culturally sanctioned standard bearers, right? The way that we pass down culturally this written testimony, this verbal testimony. It could just be used to talk about like conversations about the good old days amongst family members or community members around the kitchen table. Each of these terms maintains a certain currency and they're all perfectly legitimate. But when we talk about formal modern oral history, we're talking about these recorded conversations purposely done for the historical record. Among the most notable of the kind of modern formal recorded oral histories would be the so-called slave narratives that are conducted by the Federal Writers Project during the 1930s and early 1940s. I'll show you the screen grab of the page right here. This consists of some 2,300 first-person accounts of slavery, augmented by hundreds of black and white photos. I'm actually going to hop out of my slides here and pull up the homepage for you so you can take a look. This is where it gets tricky as I hop between screen shares. So here you can see the homepage of the collection. And I encourage you to explore the collections we're going to be looking at today further before you do your own interviewing. So here's the Born in Slavery Slave Narratives Project. I'd like to let you listen to a snippet so you can get a feel for the power of this work. As I play it, I'm going to have a transcript on the screen so you can follow along. Linda, let me know, are you seeing the transcript right now or are you still seeing the homepage? You're seeing the transcript. Excellent. Okay, so let's play a snippet from this interview with Wallace Quarterman.
From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Born in 1844. My name is Wallace Quarterman, in and through the state of Georgia.
Welcome to the American Folklife Center's podcast series, Voices from the Days of Slavery, Stories, Songs, and Memories. Drawn from the unique collections of the Center's archive, the series presents first-person accounts of African Americans whose experiences spanned the last years of slavery. They were recorded during the 1930s and 40s, most often for the large-scale documentation projects sponsored by New Deal agencies during and after the Great Depression. Many of these recordings survive only as fragments, and the audio quality occasionally suffers due to the deterioration of the original recorded media. Nevertheless, the compelling voices of these individuals transport the listener to a defining period in this country's history. In this interview from 1935, Mr. Wallace Quarterman of St. Simons Island, Georgia, recalls the last days of slavery for Zora Neale Hurston, Alan Lomax, and Mary Elizabeth Barnacle of the Library of Congress.
Morning, I was putting in breakfast in the house, and the big gun shot to put the big gun shot. So I buy carrying breakfast in the house. The overseer asked me, what is that if that is thunder? I said, I don't know. I knew what the answer was. And so he shot 3 times and he commenced to shoot and tell the pit commenced to rattle on the pit. And he called me and told me to run down in the field and tell Peter to turn the people loose that the Yankees come. And so I run down in the field and Super followed it down Peter and told him, Mr. Gigas to turn the people loose because the Yankees come. And so he said that Wallace was lying and he said so. When he said so, then the Yankee beat to the land and they drunk. You understand? You don't give him what he put.
I'm going to break it there in the interest of time. So these are obviously incredibly important interviews that are capturing these perspectives that otherwise would have been left out of the historical record. Now, I should note that today, historians have a lot of concerns about these, although they do capture these important narratives. There are some concerns about the power dynamics. Here you had often white men from the government coming to interview individuals who had lived under the horrific institution of slavery. Would they feel empowered to speak freely? Were they trying to tell the interviewers what they want to hear, right? The power dynamics in interviews is something that we always want to consider. Nevertheless, keeping that in mind, an incredibly important resource that individuals had the foresight to capture before it was too late. If we fast forward a little bit in the kind of history of oral history to the World War II period, an American gentleman by the name of Forrest Hogue is considered a pioneer in the field of oral history. He deployed to Europe and conducted interviews with soldiers in the field, and not just commanders, right? Wanting to understand the experience of the enlisted men. The extensive use of oral histories during World War II led to its widespread acceptance by the US Army after 1945. And because of active campaigning during the war, practitioners such as Hogue and the wider community of academic historians who, often found themselves under attack. We'll talk a little more about the value of oral history. Can you trust oral history, right? But the fact that it was being adopted by the US military helped to legitimize oral history in the eyes of many. Historians generally consider the formal modern discipline of oral history as beginning with the work of Alan Nevins at Columbia University in the post-war years, though. Nevins was the first to really initiate a systematic and disciplined effort to record on tape, preserve, and then make available for future researchers recollections deemed to be of historical significance. This actually starts because he's working on a biography of President Grover Cleveland, and he finds that there's just a total lack of sources, lack of letters, lack of diaries, lack of memoirs, these sources that historians and biographers generally rely upon. And so he comes up with the idea of conducting interviews with participants in recent history so that in the future, historians are not running into the same roadblocks that he is. Early interviews centered at Columbia University and then elsewhere tended to focus on elites, leaders in business, profession, the politics. But as time goes on, especially influenced by the social movements of the 60s and 70s, oral history's potential to capture the experiences of those traditionally left out of the historical record, kind of like the Slave Narratives Project had done, is really recognized. And today, you more and more see oral history work done with blue collar workers and racial and ethnic minorities and women and labor and political activists, and a variety of people who generally don't have biographies written about them, right? Who generally are not going to be found in the traditional written archival record. And so this is a wonderful way to insert those voices back in. Think about it, few people leave behind their memories. Linda was talking about individuals who had an awareness of the Underground Railroad. Most people don't leave behind their memoirs. They're not donating their personal papers. So when they die, those stories die with them. But oral history is a great way to address that. So just to summarize, oral history is a self-conscious, disciplined conversation between two people about some aspect of the near or distant past considered to be of historical significance and intentionally recorded for public access. Okay, that's key. Although the conversation takes the form of the interview, where you've got one person generally in charge of asking the questions and one person generally answering them, as I said, at the heart, it is a dialogue. You are not locked into the questions. You see those crime shows on TV, right? And either the lawyer, or the judge, or the police officer is yelling, just answer the questions, just yes or no, right? It's not like that in an oral history interview. It is a dialogue. It is a conversation. So if you are convinced of the legitimacy and importance of oral history and you're interested in doing your own oral histories, as I said, I strongly encourage people to get out there first and explore the collections that are available, both for inspiration and ideas as you advance in your own projects. This can really help you be thoughtful about your technique and about the way you want your own interviews to work. Perhaps the most well-known oral history project in the States is the Library of Congress Veterans History Project, the homepage of which you can see here on the screen. Let's take a listen to a brief overview about this project and their goals. There we go.
You interviews from the Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress. You'll hear from members of Congress who've served in the military, including Senator John McCain and Representative Sam Johnson, both of whom served as honorary pallbearers at Admiral Stockdale's funeral you just watched. We'll begin this next segment of American Perspectives with a look at what the Veterans History Project is all about.
The Veterans Oral History Project was created in 2000 by an act of Congress, and the legislation was co-sponsored by Ron Kind of Wisconsin. Ron created this project out of personal experience. He was at a family reunion and he was speaking with his father and his uncle about their wartime experiences, and he realized he'd like to have a record of that for his children and grandchildren so that they would know about what his relatives did in the war and how they served their country. So he decided that this would be a good national project to create, with people volunteering to offer their own experiences about their wartime experiences to be archived at the Library of Congress. And so the Library of Congress took over this project, and to date we have over 35,000 individuals in the project.
Why did the Library of Congress decide to take part in this project?
Well, it was a natural because after all, the Library of Congress is a repository for so many important collections of this country. And we have the professional staff to take care of those collections. And so the American Folklife Center here at the Library of Congress was deemed the best place for these collections. Today, we have over 35,000 individuals in the collection, and about 1,500 of those have been fully digitized and are available at our website, which is www.loc.gov/VETS, vets.
And how are you gathering all of this material?
Well, this is a volunteer project we don't have the staff to go out and interview people and collect other material. And by the way, we do collect other material. In addition to oral history interviews, we collect letters and photographs, journals and diaries, and memoirs from people. So it's a record of service that can be an interview, but can also take other forms. We count on partner organizations, civic organizations, church groups, veterans organizations to find veterans, to interview those veterans, or to ask them to submit material to the Library of Congress.
What kind of information related to the veterans' experience are you looking for?
We're basically looking for some record of their service, and it can take many forms, as I've said. It can be an oral history interview on videotape or audio tape. It can be a series of letters that they wrote while they were in the service. It can be a memoir that they wrote after they got out of the service. It can also be a journal or a diary that they kept while they were in the service. And in some cases, we collect photographs that a veteran might have taken while they were in the service, either as an amateur or professional photographer. And we also collect some artwork, people who were aspiring artists or maybe even already professional artists while they were in the military, and drew sketches and made paintings of their service. And these are a record of service as well as written material.
Can you give us a little more detail on how someone can participate? I know there are kits involved. Can you explain that aspect of this?
Yeah, they can go to our website or write us directly and ask for a kit which explains what the scope of our collections is. In other words, what material we take, what we're looking for, and what material we don't take. And then it has some forms that you can fill out when you send in the material. And it also has tips on how to create a good oral history interview, the proper techniques, the proper surroundings for an interview. And so this kit is kind of like a do-it-yourself kit.
So you don't have to be a professional videographer to do this.
I'm going to break it there in the interest of time since we have limited time today, but it tells you a little bit about this massive oral history project. And I just wanted to show you their link here. So we'll talk in the second portion of today's session about what you're going to do with your interviews, right? Well, for those of you who are with the South Jersey Quakers, Linda's got some plans for you, and we'll talk about that. But for the rest of you, right, there may be an appropriate repository out there where you can do the interviews and then donate them to an existing collection, like, for example, the Veterans History Project. Let's take a listen to, well, we'll skip that. Just making sure we have enough time to do everything we need to do. So we looked at the veterans ones. Just quickly, let's say you are interested in the experience of immigrants in our country, right? Well, Ellis Island Statue of Liberty Partnership, they have an extensive oral history program also. Just remind everybody to please make sure you're on mute if you're not talking. Thank you so much. Just make sure you're on mute if you're not talking. All right, great. So let's take a listen to a snippet of an interview with May Abrams.
Now, this is Janet Levine for the National Park Service, and it's March 4th, March 4th, 1993, and I'm here in Clifton, New Jersey with May Abrams, who was born May Rappaport, and in 1908 she was born, and she came here from Russia when she was 5 years old. And that was before the First World War, and it was either 1913 or 1914.
I think it was 19. Well, the First World War started in 1913.
Oh, okay.
Then I came in 1913 because we left Russia, and then I know the war started.
Okay. So I'm very happy to finally get to talk to you. And let's begin by your saying your date of birth and the town where you were born.
Well, I was born, we didn't have a date. In Russia, they did not keep records. So when we came to America, we all, the four of us, made up dates for our birthdays, and we kept it since then. We asked my mother, whenabouts were you born? She said, oh, you were born near this holiday, and you were born near this holiday. So they picked me for July 29th.
Okay, and so July 29th, 1908.
Yes.
And where were you born?
I was born in a little town called Jeremetz.
Could you possibly spell that
No,
or make a guess?
Zerometz, Jeremetz. And it was, and I remember living there in a very small one room house, because we had been dispossessed from a big estate where my father was the keeper. You know, those people were called pirates. Jews were not allowed to own big properties, and this was a big estate.
Okay, I'm going to break it there again in the interest of time. So as you listen, you start to pick up on things. And these are some of the techniques we're going to talk about in the second half of the workshop, starting with an introduction, asking open-ended questions, asking good follow-up questions. Okay, this is something that you learn as you listen to these interviews. Let's look at just one more big national program. I mean, there's really an oral history of virtually everything if you start looking. My students once bought me a book for the end of the semester. It was an oral history of the movie Clueless. I mean, there's an oral history for everything. So let's take a look. We were speaking earlier about Dave's book set during the Holocaust. Let's take a listen to one of the many powerful narratives available via the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum.
Food, or how much food we got while working in this camp. We got, in the morning, we got, I don't know how to describe it to you, a slice of bread about this long and about this thick. Sometimes you got a little marmalade and sometimes a little piece of butter that you put on it. And we also got a bowl of soup at 12 o'clock at the place when we worked. At night when we got home, we got another bowl of soup. You know, in the bowl of soup, you could find anything in it, but believe me, it was the best delicacy we have ever eaten. It was good. Since the doctor told us that we are quarantined, they cut out one bowl of soup, because if we are not working, we do not need so much food. So we got one bowl of soup and one slice of bread. This was the thing. We survived.
I could listen to these stories all day, but again, in the interest of time, we have to break there. So these are big national level, well-funded projects we have been looking at, but grassroots projects proliferate as well. You don't need a lot of money. You don't need a lot of staff to do meaningful oral history work. So for example, you're seeing on the screen now, or you should be seeing, please tell me if you're not, the landing page for my Tracking Sandy Monmouth County Remembers Oral History Project. This was an exhibit and oral history project that I started with the Monmouth County Historical Association at the 5th anniversary of Superstorm Sandy to begin to document people's lived experience during this so-called 100-year storm. So you don't need a lot of money to capture these stories if you don't have it. Let me let you listen to a snippet of an interview from a woman who her home is destroyed, and she talks about going back and seeing this.
Somebody called.
Yeah. So the storm hits the 29th into the 30th. When you wake up that morning, right? Do you try to get back to the house that day, right after the storm?
No, we were told not to go on the roads by the National Guard. But my husband and my nephew snuck back here just to see what it looked like. And they couldn't really get through the streets. So they went through the neighbor's backyard because it was still receding at the time when they got back here. And they came in the house and they were just like, oh, it was just horrible.
When he comes back to tell you what he's seen here, did he bring you photos or was he just trying to relay it?
No, he did bring a photo of the house around the corner where the water was still there and the man's car was under it. So that was that. And then we snuck back the next day or 2 days. I can't remember if it was 2 days or a week later. No, it must have been a few days, I'm sorry. We came back, he took me, and it was just like a war zone. Everything all over, pots, pans, dirt, mud, everything.
About how hot?
So, well, again, in the interest of time, break it there. Throughout this interview, the woman is obviously emotional, and she talks to us about her experience with the storm, but also then the aftermath of the storm, having to deal with the insurance companies, the impact it took on her family's physical and emotional health, etc. These interviews become a method of preserving the stories, yes, but also allow historians to contemplate lessons learned in many cases. Let me show you just one more sample oral history program. So this would be, again, at the grassroots level, an oral history project I recently started to document the 20th anniversary of 9/11, right, and its impact on Monmouth County. Monmouth County lost 147 people on September 11th. In addition to that, thousands.
Organization is called Foster Closet.
Just again, a reminder to please make sure you're muted if you're not speaking. Thank you. So in this oral history project, it's currently quite active. I've got several interviews scheduled right now, but we're capturing the experiences of family members who lost loved ones, people from Monmouth County who made it home that day, emergency workers who met the ferries, bringing people over to Atlantic Highlands from ground zero. It's really powerful. And one thing we found, this oral history project was tied to an exhibit which recently came down. One thing we found was that even though 9/11 is, quote, only 20 years ago, people were throwing away their photos. They had deleted their emails. That, the story was being lost already. And by sitting down and doing the oral histories, you're able to preserve it for future generations. Let's take a listen to just a snippet of one last interview. This is Stephen Padula. He worked for the Monmouth County Prosecutor's Office and was detailed to work with the FBI over at Ground Zero.
So let's talk a little bit about the evidence and DNA collection at Ground Zero, please.
Okay, so when I told you when we were up at the FBI Command Center, they would give you out, they were called details, assignments. So eventually now we got assigned to, if you don't mind, we got assigned to Ground Zero. And at that time we were told we were going to assist with some perimeter security, but we're also going to be assisting with any type of evidence collection. When we got there, we drove in the tunnels. Everything was shut down. The signs were all you were able to go right downtown without seeing another car. And when you got to the perimeter, it was pretty clear pretty quickly that there wasn't going to be a lot of evidence collection. But if you don't mind me adding, I will say that the expressions of the EMS, the fire, and the police that were there when we got there, and they probably had been there from the beginning because nobody wanted to leave. It looked like, and I can only say this from television shows, it was a war zone. It was like the pictures that you saw in France with the bombings or during World War II. It was just devastation. There wasn't a single building in that area that you could even went in to get a glass of water. Everything was bombed out. And they set up little tents on the side where they would have people going over, they were hosing them down. You would try to give a hello or somebody or an acknowledgement to somebody, and there was emotionless. They just wanted to work. They wanted to do something. They had that bucket brigade. The people were just moving and doing things and putting fire hoses all over, just shooting onto for them to actually get into the pile, some of those pieces of iron that were laid on top of each other with thousands and thousands of pounds, they can only go in between the debris. So it was heart-wrenching to see these firemen who, and I want to say the police and the EMS, all of them, they went there and they knew that some of their partners, they weren't leaving. And
and I hate to break it there in the interest of time, but we'll pause. So now that we have covered a bit about oral history and its goals and some of the different projects that are out there, just to give you an idea of what this work looks and sounds like, and the power that oral history has to allow people to tell their stories in their own words. That I think is just so very important. Let's take just a quick break. Linda, you want to take just 5 minutes so people can stretch their legs and refill their coffee, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about your own interview techniques. Okay, I have 10:25, so shall we jump back in, Linda? Okay, great. So doing oral history, again, this is the down and dirty version. But I'm going to give you my contact info and share additional resources. So if you have questions as you start doing your own work, you can certainly reach out. So let's say you have been convinced of the importance of doing oral history, that it is a worthwhile investment of your time. Now what? You're going to decide who you want to interview, right? So those of you who are here from South Jersey Quakers, Linda will be working with you on that, but just in general, decide who you're going to be interviewing. If you have a pool of potential interviewees, how do you decide who you want to try to interview first, right? Well, you might think of things like age, right? Often, if you have narrators who are older, who are perhaps not in the best health, you want to get to them first, right? Before their stories are lost. You might also consider the potential narrator's relevance to a given story, right? So if you have limited time and you have to decide who you're going to interview first, how you're going to prioritize, well, if you're looking to do interviews about the history of the South Jersey Quakers, well, who's been involved in the organization the longest, right? I mean, so you try to make informed decisions about the order in which you schedule your narrators. How do you find people, right? Well, it depends on who you're looking to interview. You may be interviewing members within your own church community, your own professional community. Just get creative. The internet has made locating narrators for given projects much, much easier. Put announcements that you're looking for narrators. If you don't know someone personally that you're going to go and get an interview, think about where you might put announcements. Social media groups are excellent for this. Publishing in newsletters. If you're looking to interview individuals, I was going to say veterans, but really it could be anybody. If you're looking to interview people about moments in history, your local nursing homes, assisted living facilities, a lot of times they are interested in partnering on projects, right? So get creative, harness the power of the internet in trying to locate people to interview. I would note, sometimes it takes some convincing to get people to agree to interview. You've got to make sure you explain very clearly to them the purpose of the project, how logistically it will work. And then so often you'll find people will say, I don't have anything interesting to say. Why would you want to interview me? No, right? But everybody has a story to tell, right? Everybody's story is unique. And so sometimes, you just have to do a little gentle convincing, explain to people why their story is important, why documenting history in this way matters. Now, we don't want to pressure people, right? Because oral history, you're not getting subpoenaed to do an oral history. You're not forced to sit down and do it. So be careful not to pressure people, but they might require that gentle convincing, and that's fine. So I would say, if your first ask goes unanswered, don't be afraid to sell yourself a little more. I would just note again, if you want to hop in with a question at any point, feel free to just go ahead and do that. Otherwise, you can save them to the end. Logistics. So before you even start, I suggest you think about what you want to do with the finished product, right? Because oral history is supposed to live out there in the public domain. There's other types of interviewing that's done, right? Journalists might interview people and, use some quotes in an article or use a 30-second soundbite on the news, and then most of that interview gets thrown in the garbage, right? Or academics, they might be interviewing people for a book project, and they do the interviews and they write their book and then they throw the interviews away. Oral history is meant to be preserved, though. So think about where you're going to donate the finished products. For the South Jersey Quakers, I think Linda is going to talk to you about collecting them, putting them on the South Jersey Quakers YouTube channel, right? For others, think about whether or not there might be an existing repository that would be happy to have your interviews, like the Veterans History Project, or your local historical society, your local school library, right? Because remember, the idea is for these to live in the public domain and be accessible. How long should your interviews be? General rule of thumb is 1 to 2 hours. I actually usually like to keep it to an hour. In his book, Don Ritchie says 2. Why not longer than that? Well, both the interviewer and the interviewee or narrator, they start to get fatigued, right? Their attention wanes. They start to give you perfunctory answers, right? So you generally want to keep your interviews to an hour, no more than 2 a session. Now, if you're doing a life history with someone, you might want to set up multiple sessions, right? But each interview session, I suggest no more than an hour or 2. How much is this going to cost, right? Ritchie in his book has a cute analogy about, if you need to eat lunch, right? You could spend $5 on lunch, or you could spend $100 on lunch, and you're still going to get that meal, right? So oral history needn't cost a lot of money. We're going to talk about technology in a little bit. You can use the recorder on your smartphone. You can use Zoom. The technology has gotten so good that you can get a very decent sound recording using those. You don't necessarily have to invest in very expensive recording equipment and external mics and lights and get it. Some repositories will do that. Okay, we're going to talk about audio versus video in a little bit, but you really don't have to. I say at the end of the day that the story is the important part, not ensuring that it's, this beautiful setting staged by a documentary, right? To me, for the oral history, the story is the important part. So it needn't be very expensive. You don't have to spend a lot of money on recording equipment. If you do have money, where I usually like to spend it is on the transcription, which again, we'll talk more about in a little bit. You can consider some projects. Some organizations have paid oral historians on their staff, right? But when we're talking about community projects, occasionally there'll be stipends for the interviewers. A lot of time it's volunteers. Generally, the narrators are not paid a stipend. This is actually kind of a hot topic in oral history right now. If you should compensate narrators for their time, or does that then create a financial pressure for people to participate? Does it create a situation where they feel compelled to tell you what you want to hear because you've paid them, right? So generally narrators are not given a stipend. So there need not be many costs associated with oral history if you don't have that funding available. I will note there are grants out there for funding oral history work. That's kind of a longer issue for another day, but there are grants out there to support the work if needed. Should you do group interviews? Generally, this is not desirable, right? You generally want the interviews to be one-on-one. Logistically, if the interviews are audio only, it can get very confusing to try to differentiate between the speakers. But even if you are doing a video interview and it's clear who is who, you just want to avoid that group think. You want to avoid people talking over each other. You want to ensure that the more naturally dominant personalities are not dominating the conversation, right? So my advice is that it's best to keep the interviews one-on-one whenever possible. If for some reason narrators are absolutely insistent that they will only be interviewed together or in a group setting, okay, you can make that work. But ideally, you would want it to be a one-on-one conversation between the interviewer and the narrator. What kind of forms will you need? It is best practice to have your narrator sign a release form, okay? There are many, many, many different sample release forms that you can go and you can look at online, right? Like the Veterans History Project shows you one online. I mean, you could Google oral history release forms and you can go and you can see a lot of different ones online. I'm going to just quickly screen share and show you the one that I have for my Monmouth Memories oral history program. This is rather lengthy as far as release forms go, because Monmouth University has a very talented legal team who, you know, I have to have my students sign contracts if we play baseball or if we make pottery, right? They like to cover all their bases. So this is rather lengthy as far as release forms go. For the South Jersey Quakers on the call, Linda, I believe, is going to work with me to come up with something that you'd be able to use. So check back with Linda on that. But for others who are out there, you can find templates online. I am not a lawyer, right? So if you want to have a lawyer consult with you on the crafting of your release, you can. But generally, the release says that the narrator is allowing themselves to be recorded, and ideally that they give permission for this to live in the public domain. I'm just seeing that there are some questions in the chat, which is kind of hard for me to monitor and talk at the same time. So let me just say, yes, we're going to talk about crafting questions in a bit. Okay, Quaker specific questions. Yes, we'll come at 11:15. So, all right. So that's a little bit about release forms. Think about if there is an existing release form out there that you can use, or if you are starting from scratch, you can find templates online and you can reach out to either an oral historian or legal counsel for some advice on how specifically to craft that. So logistically, the next thing you're going to want to do is think about where you're going to conduct the interviews, right? You want to find a quiet, distraction-free space, right? You don't want to be like meeting at Starbucks to do the interview. You want there to be as few distractions, as little background noise as possible. Are you going to do it on your turf or theirs? You know, if you know the person, this is a little easier to navigate. When you're interviewing a stranger, you know, you've got to give a little more thought to this. If you have them come to you, the benefit is you control the setting. You can make sure there's no barking dogs or children interrupting or ringing phones, right? If you go to their location, you have a little less control over this. However, they might be more comfortable, more at ease, and that might make for a better interview, right? So this is something for you to consider. Think about what type of recording equipment you are going to use. For our South Jersey Quakers on the call, Linda is willing to provide support with Zoom if you decide to go that way. Even before the pandemic, there was a lot of debate amongst oral historians over what was best, audio only or video interviews. Some oral historians preferred audio only. I was in that camp before the pandemic. I liked audio only because I thought it was so simple. One, logistically, selfishly, it's a little easier to manage. Even back when I started doing oral history interviews and we were using like micro cassettes and actual recorders, it was easier to manage. But you can almost forget that an audio recorder is there, okay? It kind of disappears into the background. And I have always thought, really allowed the narrator to relax, just to forget that they were being recorded and just tell their story. Okay. Linda, yes.
Can we go back to your turf or theirs? I'm wondering if the interview, now what is your experience if the interview is done in a person's home or office? Is there a possibility that they might go get documents or things to bring out that could be recorded as well?
Yeah, we're going
does that happen very often?
We're going to talk about photos in a bit. So they can do that if you're on, quote, their turf. I'm just using, common terminology. Or you could have asked them in advance to bring things with them to, say you want to do it at your meeting house, or, you could ask people to bring things with them. So that's something to consider. I do a lot of work with Carol Fowler, this amazing oral historian from the National Guard Militia Museum of New Jersey. She always has the vets come to the National Guard Militia Museum in Seagirt, but she has them bring scrapbooks and photos. And at the end of the interview, she does a session where they go through and they show her and the camera everything that they've brought with them. So, you can kind of make that work regardless of where you are, just things to think about. So we were talking about video or audio only. So audio, you can kind of forget that there's a performance happening, that the recorder is even there. Some oral historians prefer video for a few reasons. You should see oral historians debate this at conferences. They prefer video for a few reasons. You can see the narrator, get a better feel for them, their mannerisms. You can see emotion. Are they crying? Are they smiling? Are they tensing up? What's their body language, right? So, that's something to think about. My concern with video pre-pandemic, and I've changed my tune, as I'll discuss more in a moment. My concern with video was that people are always worried. Am I sitting up properly? Does my hair look funny? Am I making a silly face, right? And you can just kind of never forget that the video is there. And then if it's a full documentary style setup where you've got, the huge, lights and the reflective backgrounds and a film crew staring at you, can you have an intimate conversation in that setting would be my concern. So just something to think about as you decide how you are going to do your interviews. As far as the technology, as I said, you needn't, if you don't have the budget, spend a tremendous amount of money on fancy recording equipment. You can get very decent sound recordings using like a GoPro camera or your voice memo app on your iPhone, or an app like RecUp is the one that I like to use, or Zoom. Many of us are familiar with Zoom. I said that pre-pandemic, I preferred audio only interviews because I thought it allowed for a more natural conversation. But with, the pandemic, I was forced to move a lot of my interviews to Zoom. And it's been working. So I would say don't discount Zoom. There are a few fellow members of oral history in the Mid-Atlantic region, a few of my fellow board members who are trained in documentary filmmaking. And so, they are intricately schooled in audio quality, et cetera, et cetera. And even they've said the quality from Zoom is good, so don't feel that you have to invest a tremendous amount of money in expensive recording equipment if you don't have it and you're not going to be comfortable using it. I do always like to have 2 recording devices running, if at all possible, just in case there is some kind of technology failure. So I actually use an old iPhone. You update your phone and you still have the old one, you can turn it on and use the recording app. So just think about it. Do you have an old handheld cassette recorder laying somewhere in a drawer? It's nice to have 2 recording devices running, if at all possible, just in case there is some tech catastrophe. Wherever you position your recording device, I encourage you to just be sure to check it momentary, just can you keep an eye on it and see if that counter is still running? Just make sure you're still recording and that there hasn't been any problem. External mics specifically, do you need an external mic? I say no. You could see what you're comfortable with. But the interviews I've played for you today from my two projects, we didn't use external mics, and you can hear it quite clearly, as long as everyone is close to the recording device. I always tell this story about I was at a conference a few years ago, and this particular panel was a professor and her students. She was talking about, they were there to present on an oral history project they'd done together as a class. And she tells a story about how she got some money to support the classwork. She was so excited, and she came in on the first day of class and she said, I got money and you're each going to get your own recording device. She had bought them like digital handheld recorders. And they were like, lady, why did you spend the money on recording devices? We could just use our phones, and we could have used that money for transcription or something. And she's like, you're just not realizing, because this was several years ago, that the technology had come so far that almost every student had a recording device in their pocket every day anyway. So I would say, don't, especially those of us who are doing it from a community grassroots perspective, don't overcomplicate the logistics of the recording. Okay, remember, if you have any questions, you can shout out, or we'll just have discussion at the end. So pre-interview planning, you've decided who you are going to interview. You've given some thought to how you're going to do the interviews and where they will live, right? So then make contact with your interviewee. Unless it's someone that you are intimately familiar with, I always like to reach out via writing first, whether it is something mailed via snail mail or whether it's just an email. But I like to reach out in writing first so I can give a very detailed description of who I am and what I would like to do. Because you get people on the phone sometimes and you're like, hi, I'm Melissa Ziobro, and I'm doing a series of oral history interviews to document the experience of Monmouth County. And people are like, whoa, what? What are you asking me to agree to? So I always like to make my first contact in writing and give a very detailed description of what I'm asking for. You may decide that you want to devise some type of pre-interview questionnaire or have a pre-interview meeting, just because, again, if this is not someone you are intimately familiar with, you want to know a little bit about them so you know how to tailor your questions, right? So when I have students interview alumni for the Monmouth Memories Oral History Program, well, we need to know a few things before we even devise the questions, right? Like, what year were they at Monmouth? If they were at Monmouth in the 1980s, we don't want to ask them about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s visit, right? So think about that. It could be as simple as some questions that you send them in your initial ask email, okay? Make sure you very clearly explain the logistics in advance, right? This is why I said to think about it in advance. You want to tell them before they even agree to participate, is it going to be audio or video? Where is it going to live? Will they get to review the transcript? Is it going to be on YouTube, for example? Explain it all to them in advance so they know exactly what they are agreeing to. I'd also suggest that you share the access agreement in advance. Don't just like slip it under their nose the day of the interview. Give it to them in advance so they really understand what they're signing, so they can have someone else look at it if they want, right? And then we got at this a little bit earlier. Consider asking them to bring old photos or something to the interview. It's nice to have a photo of your interviews kind of then and now, just depending on what you're interviewing them about, right? So if you're interviewing World War II vets, you might ask them to bring you a picture of them in uniform then, and then you'll have a picture of them at the time of the interview. But you can think about, depending on what interview you're doing, how you might like to augment the interview with other photos or archival documents. So you should know a little bit about each narrator. As we said, you might just happen to know them, right? Or if you don't, if you're not intimately familiar with them, you might have them do some type of pre-interview questionnaire. Then you're going to devise your question list. If you are doing a group of interviews, right? If you're interviewing a bunch of people, or if you're part of a project that's interviewing a bunch of people, you may have a general question list, but you want to tailor that question list for each individual narrator. I work in the Department of History and Anthropology, so we're like a hybrid product of the School of Humanities and Social Sciences. And, you know, some of my anthropology colleagues, if they're doing research, they want one approved questionnaire document. They want every person to answer those questions, only those questions, right? And they want to compare the data. Oral history doesn't work like that, right? You want to tailor your questions so that they are relevant to your narrators. So take our, you know, South Jersey Quaker friends. We'll talk a little more in a moment how you might together put your heads together and come up with a rough question list, but then you're going to tailor it for everyone. Oral historians like to ask open-ended questions. Remember, I used that example earlier of like the crime shows. You're not going to be like, just the facts, ma'am, yes or no. You don't want to ask yes or no questions as a general rule. You want to ask open-ended questions that prompt them to tell a story. Now, you might ask clarifying questions then, like, I'm sorry, did you say that it was November 15th that you first got your insurance check? And the answer yes or no or something, right? So you may ask clarifying questions, but in general, you want your questions to be open-ended. I find a lot of times you will ask someone a question and they will launch into this big story. Like sometimes 20 minutes will go by before I say a word. And then they'll go, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, I'm rambling. And I say, no, that's perfect. That's what I want you to do, you know? So you're supposed to be asking open-ended questions that just provide a platform for the narrator to tell their story. Be careful with your questions. Don't lead the witness, if I can use some of that CSI language again. I have an example here. What's the difference between asking, do you support a balanced budget to end waste, fraud, and abuse in the government versus do you support a balanced budget, right? Like the way it's phrased the first time, who wants to say that they support waste, fraud, and abuse in the government, right? So you've kind of led the witness, led the narrator in one direction. Craft your questions really carefully so that your biases or are not showing, so that you're not trying to lead them to give the certain answer that you want to hear, okay? You heard this in some of the sample interviews that I played for you. You usually want to start your recording with an introduction of some sort. We'll talk more about that in a moment. Like, my name is Melissa Ziobro, blah, blah, blah. Your first question, though, should usually be something along the lines of, where and when were you born and raised, right? You want to kind of start at the beginning for a few reasons. It warms the interviewer up to field these kind of softball questions, right? But then it also provides context for the rest of the interview, knowing a little bit about early life experiences. And then, you know, you go through and you ask your questions. I always like to end with some variation of, well, this brings me to the end of my prepared questions. Is there anything else you'd like to add that we haven't covered? Because you always want to like leave the ball in their court, right? This is their storytelling experience. So make sure that they have said everything they want to say before you close things out, okay? So for our South Jersey Quakers here, we could brainstorm a little bit right now. I'd love to hear from some of you, and then you'll probably take the conversation offline later. But I know Linda was saying, you know, worked in there, she would love for you to have questions like, how did Quakers make the community a better place? What does it mean to be a Quaker and live your beliefs? What are some other questions the South Jersey Quakers might ask? Shout out, go ahead, Dave.
Oh, okay, well, I'm not a birthright Quaker. I came to the Quaker community in 2003. So I would want to know if the person was born into the Quaker community and information about that, what it would be like to be raised in a meeting, et cetera, or if somebody is what we call a convinced friend, how did that journey happen, and all the questions that would be associated with how they became a Quaker.
Excellent. Anyone else have ideas off the top of their head? I would suggest, and I don't want to tell Linda how to run her project, but one thing I do when I'm leading groups, you might start a Google Doc where anyone who's going to be participating in your project can go in and add questions. And that'll be kind of your central database of questions. And then as each interviewer goes off to do their own thing, they copy and paste that list, and then they, alter it to meet their needs for a given narrator. Linda?
Amy put something in the chat. Amy, do you want to ask your question?
I was just answering the question of brainstorming ideas of what you could, I think there's a lot of fascinating stories out there, but since we're talking specifically about Quakers, it would be interesting to zero in and ask people about specific service work that they may have done that relates to their Quaker values.
Good, that's good. And that is very open-ended, right? Provides them this platform to get out there. General rule of thumb, I think in the Ritchie book, he says you should do roughly 8 hours of pre-interview research before doing the interview. I think for most grassroots projects, volunteer-run projects, that's probably a lot, right? But you do want to take the time to do some research about your narrator so that they feel that you have come in, with some genuine interest in them and their life. It really helps to build credibility, establish kind of the authenticity of the experience. So yeah, and Linda, if you need any help setting up a Google Doc or something that could be kind of the sandbox for your group to play and brainstorm interviews, questions together in real time, I'd be happy to help you with that later.
Thank you. One of the other areas that we really would like to have people talk about is being a parent or a grandparent in what does it mean to bring Quaker values and beliefs into the parenting process or grandparenting process. We really would like to have a whole series of people talking about different kinds of experiences, particularly when there are difficulties. Kids are kids and things happen. So what are good ways and creative ways to deal with particular circumstances? We have two longer interviews with two people in each of the videos where people talk about that a little, but we'd like to really expand that piece. Another topic might have to do with specific meeting projects. 3 or 4 meetings here in Haddonfield Quarter sponsored what was called the Garden Project, where Newton Meeting in Camden hosted women in a pre-release program. The women would come over on a Saturday morning, work in the garden or do things, have different kinds of activities, and then they'd make a meal together. And it was a very important humanizing process. After having been in state prison, women were called by their real names and had a little more freedom. And so that's that kind of project where friends are working together would be really important. And if there were key issues or moments in the meeting history, that might be helpful. But ultimately, what we'd love to get at is, how do the Quaker values play out in real life?
This is very exciting. It sounds like you have so much to cover. Okay, so I'm going to move on from there just in the interest of time. Continuing with the pre-interview planning. You'll have to consider if you want to share the questions with your narrator in advance of the interview. There are pros and cons. This is one of those things oral historians, feel differently about. If you do, it allows them to prepare, and that's a pro. It's also a con, right? Because you want them to be telling you an organic story. You don't want them to feel that they have to type everything out and then read to you from a paper, right? So just something for you to think about whether or not you want to share their questions in advance. I generally do not unless asked. That's just my opinion.
Is there a possibility for a middle ground where it's sort of sharing the topics in advance and then having
of course.
questions?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because again, we're not trying to trick anyone or catch them off guard. You just want to avoid a situation where they're telling these really kind of canned, pre-planned stories, because it should be a little more organic. But that's certainly a good middle ground, Carlton. So as you heard, interviews generally start with some type of introduction said right onto the recording. This is helpful in setting the tone, setting the context, but also in case the interview ever gets separated, from its paperwork. So this is just one I nabbed from an old interview. This is Melissa Ziobro, command historian, interviewing Major General Randolph P. Strong, commander, U.S. Army CECOM Life Cycle Management Command. This interview is taking place at Fort Monmouth on 30 June 2010. It's the second of Major General Strong's biannual interviews, right? So you physically say this at the outset of the recording just to set the tone and context. I'm sure I have all adults on here. You generally have to remind students of this, but I guess anybody could use a reminder. Always confirm your space, confirm with the interviewee, and test your equipment the day before. You never want to show up to your interview, fumbling with your equipment. Whatever app you're using, whatever recording device you're using, make sure you are well schooled in using it in advance. When I do longer workshops, we actually will break out into groups and practice using the recording equipment and things like that. So, practice, just do a little interview with your spouse or your child, just to make sure how to use the recording, where it's going to be saved, right? That how to upload it to the cloud, things like that. Do a little practice session in advance if you can. All right, so showtime, day of the interview. Make sure you have your recording device too, if possible. Backup never hurts. Make sure you've got fresh batteries. Make sure you've got your cords, right? These seem like such simple little things, but you don't want that device dying on you mid-interview. I always like to have a printed copy of the question list with me. I find it's less distracting than trying to toggle back and forth on a device of some sort. Bring a hard copy of your release, which hopefully they've seen in advance so that they can now sign it. I don't think any of you will be interviewing minors, but if you are, keep in mind their parents will likely have to sign as well. You record your intro and then you segue into your question list. Be flexible though. That question list is not set in stone. If you don't get to them all, it's okay. It's not the end of the world. Ask good follow-up questions. Okay. If you need something clarified or if a new question occurs to you, go for it, right? It's not set in stone. Try really hard not to interrupt. This is hard, right? Because sometimes we want to jump in and share our own story or when someone is just kind of collecting their thoughts, sometimes silence is awkward. And so we rush in to fill the void, right? So try to be really careful not to interrupt. And when you think someone has finished their thought, even wait a few beats. Let there be a little silence, because a lot of times what we find is someone will pause, and if given a few beats, they'll start talking again. They'll add more to the story, right? So don't be afraid of that silence. Let it go on for a couple beats. That's fine. As I said, ask good follow-up questions. Always end with, is there anything you'd like to add that we haven't covered? And then just again, make sure you sincerely thank them for their time, for their participation in the project. After the interview, I advocate ensuring that the interview lives in more than one place. Okay. The way I usually do interviews is, I record them. Generally, I would record them on my phone, which then automatically uploads to Dropbox. So it lives on the cloud, and then I put them on a thumb drive also. You just try to have them live in 2 places if at all possible. Computers crash, devices die, things happen. So try to have it live in 2 places if at all possible. You'll want to think about if you are going to create a transcript. This is another thing oral historians like to bicker over. What is the actual oral history? What's important, the recording or the transcript? Well, the transcript is, in its best possible form, a verbatim account of what exactly was said. Transcription is really interesting because it's an interpretation of the conversation, right? What word did they say? Do I note that they laughed? Right, that's a whole nother issue we don't have time for. But in general, the transcription is a verbatim account of the conversation. It's not necessary that you make a transcript, right? I don't not do an oral history because you don't have the money for the transcript, or you don't have time to do the transcript. Get the story, that's the important part. But I will tell you that researchers love transcripts. They love them. You can read more quickly than you can listen to a whole hour interview. And if they are digital, you can keyword search them, right? So researchers really love transcripts. It takes, though, roughly 6 to 8 hours to transcribe 1 hour of audio. It's very labor intensive. I've done it, many times. It's very labor intensive. So it's tricky. There are companies you can use to do the transcription for you. There's one I use called rev.com. They charge $1.25 per minute. This is where grant money comes in very helpful. $1.25 per minute, and they're exceedingly accurate. They turn it over in like a day. So that's something that you'll have to think about. And for the South Jersey Quakers, you'll consult with Linda on that, I'm sure. So do the interviews regardless of whether or not you can do transcripts, but then do transcripts if you can find a way. Just because for long-term preservation purposes, paper is reliable, and because it's going to make it much, much more useful to researchers in the future. A lot of times people say, isn't there some program you can use that will just automatically transcribe, like voice recognition software? The technology is just not there yet. Voice recognition software works better, like I can voice text into my phone, for short things. But doing like an hour, 2 hour long interview, there's just nothing out there that's going to do it nice and neatly just yet. There's some equipment you can use, but it's so messy that it's very, very labor intensive to go back and edit it. So, that's just a little snippet on transcripts. Think about what you're going to do. If you do get a transcript then created, you'll have to think about whether or not you want the interviewees to review them. Some projects have the narrators review their transcripts because they can help, right? Sometimes we don't know what those proper nouns are, the names, the places. The problem is you don't want them heavily editing it. Sometimes people will read their interview and go, oh my God, I sound terrible. I interviewed a very high-ranking woman at Fort Monmouth once, and she said, this is ridiculous. I sound like a Valley girl. Like I have a reputation to uphold. I can't sound like this. But it's a conversation, not a speech. And we talk like human beings, So think about what you're going to do there. Also, in the end, the transcript has to match the recording. And we're not going to be editing the recording to take out all of the ums and the gonnas and so, tread carefully there, think about what you want to do there. And then once the interview is done, consider the possibilities. What can you do with the interviews? The interviews in full can live in the public domain, right? If you have a website, for example, I showed you my websites. A quick, easy way, if you don't have a lot of tech support, if you don't have a paid team running your website, is to get the interviews on YouTube, which I think for the South Jersey Quakers, Linda is going to talk to you about. You can get them up there in full. And then the interviews can be excerpted and used in a lot of ways, right? So snippets can be used in podcasts, in documentaries, in exhibits, in publications, right? But we always want to keep the original product in full, okay? This is a question that has come up forever, right? Can I trust oral history? Well, how do I know that people aren't purposely lying about things or misremembering? What's the point of this? You can't even trust it. I say that's silly. How do you know? I mean, you have to assess any source for accuracy, right? If you are reading letters or diaries, you have to consider who was making them and when and what were their motivations and were they censoring themselves. And if you're reading historic newspapers, you still have to think about the motivations of the publisher and what might have went wrong, right? So could there be problems with oral history? Yes. The one oral history I played for you earlier, do you remember the woman said that World War I started in 1913? World War I started in 1914, right? But as with any source, it is the historian's job to cross-reference, to use multiple sources, right? And so, yes, could inaccuracies accidentally or purposely sneak into oral history? Sure, but that is the problem with any source that compiles the historical record. So, you use oral histories as you do any other source. Anybody have any questions or comments on that? Okay. So for those of you who might be embarking on your own projects soon, you have Linda as a resource. You have me. I'm going to share a Google Doc in the chat that has a list of links that might be helpful to you, and it includes my email. So you can feel free to reach out to me and pick my brain if you'd like. The professional development organization for those of you in the Mid-Atlantic is Oral History in the Mid-Atlantic region. Please check out our website. We are on Facebook and Twitter. I hope you will find us there. We recently released the call for papers for our annual conference, and we just launched a lunch and learn session where we're going to try to do this once a month. People can just come and say, hey, this is what I'm working on, and I'd like to pick your brain, right? So follow us on, as I said, Facebook and Twitter. As I noted, the National Professional Development Organization is the Oral History Association. Tons of resources on their website, best practices, bibliographies for further reading, etc. So I encourage you to check that out. There's also a wonderful oral history listserv. Again, the links for all of these websites will be in the Google Doc I'm going to share with you, but you can go there and you can ask questions. I would push again Don Ritchie's book, Doing Oral History. He doesn't give me a cut of the proceeds or anything for promoting it. It's just excellent. So I can't recommend that enough. I mean, there's a huge body of literature out there about oral history. Like I said, there's an entire master's degree program at Columbia in oral history. You better believe there's a lot of books to read, right? But this is just a wonderful soup to nuts book for someone who's hitting the ground running, doing some interviewing. The other book I would really recommend is, and this is a slim one, but it's a guide to oral history in the law. So it talks more about legal releases. It talks about issues of libel or slander that might come up, etc. So that's another good one for you. And with that, my goodness, it is 11:12. How is that for timing, Linda? I've got a few minutes to take questions from the general group, and then we can move into the 11:15 session for the South Jersey Quakers. So general questions, please unmute yourself and shout out. And while you're looking for your mute button, I'm going to put this document with resources in the chat for you.
There's several things in the chat. Kathleen suggested that we talk for the Quakers to consider if the meeting had a conflict, how did it handle it? What was the conflict about, and was it handled well? I think that's a really important part of our history as well. There was also a question about Zoom. the Zoom transcript feature. Has anybody used the Zoom transcript?
You can try it. It's quite messy, and it may be that I have been a little spoiled because I have been able to get funding to do the professional transcription. But try it, try and see what works for you. It's certainly better than starting from scratch. That's for sure.
Okay.
I have a question. If you're interviewing someone who is potentially in a position of starting to have memory loss, is that okay to do? There's one gentleman in our meeting that I really want to talk to. He's 93, and I'm not entirely sure what his capability of recollection is. But is it worth doing? Or
Absolutely. I would just suggest that with his permission, you find a way to perhaps annotate the file, or, if you think he's comfortable even addressing that in the interview. You obviously, given his privacy, you want to tread lightly there. I think it's absolutely still worthwhile to record that. The other thing I have to tell you is it is so personally fulfilling. Even people who are nervous at the beginning of their interview and maybe took some convincing usually feel so good after. And families, you mentioned that this gentleman is older. I have, and I'm going to tear up, I have on more than one occasion had families reach out to me because their loved one passes and they find the interview, and now they're going to have that. And that's a beautiful thing. So in the case of this gentleman, right, you want to preserve his story for the greater historical record, but he's got loved ones too who will be so thrilled to have that after he's gone. So I would say don't let that be an impediment. And when you talk about scheduling the interviews, that's someone you want to do as soon as possible before he continues to deteriorate.
Thank you.
Good luck.
I actually had an experience with that. My mother went into a retirement community just as COVID shut down. And so we made a point of talking every day. And there were times when she was confused, but there were other times that some stories came through that were just absolute gems, things I'd never heard of. And so what you might want to do is schedule a couple of interviews so that you make sure you catch the gentleman on a good day. It was really worth having those repeated conversations.
That's good advice, Linda.
I have a question about content advisory warnings. I know that a lot of folks are putting, some sort of be aware that this conversation discusses, especially if there's any violence involved and things like that. Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, that's really up to the organization who's conducting them. But there are organizations who will put that at the beginning of a given interview, or they kind of just have it pop up on their website generally, kind of as a blanket statement for the whole collection, because it's difficult to determine who will be, I don't want to say traumatized or offended. Those seem like charged words, but you see what I'm saying? Who's going to react to what? So you might just have it kind of pop up as a whole, or you could have it, I know for the South Jersey Quakers, Linda intends to put these on YouTube. It could be part of the YouTube description for the videos, something like that.
Do you have any examples of good wording for that? So that it's not overly generalized. So it's just like, this is our legal disclaimer. And yet on the other hand, if it's general enough to be like, people are telling personal stories that may involve, or, do you have any examples?
Yeah, can you send me an email and I would be happy, or you know what I'll do? I will, so everybody can benefit from it. In the chat, I dropped a Google Doc link to further readings for everybody. And what I'll do is put it in there so you can see some different examples.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
I'll add to that. Sure.
I had a question. If no one else was. Anyway, I had a question on digitizing physical media and pictures and whatnot. I've done a lot of it myself, both professionally and for personal projects, such as digitalizing photos and audio tapes and things like that. And I was wondering if there's some sort of either free or inexpensive resource for preserving all types, such as like film reels and things like that. Because I know with especially like video and audio tapes, they're getting a little bit end of life. And I know it's not 100% oral history, but I've had some interviews, from a long time ago that I was managed to save. So.
Yeah, this is something we do a whole week on this in my oral history class, and it kind of falls more into like archives management, but the preservation of legacy interviews, right? And so ideally, you would want interviews to be constantly upgraded to whatever the modern format is. So, from cassette tapes to DVDs to digital files, but that takes a lot of money and it takes a lot of time that a lot of organizations don't have. There are companies you can outsource that work to. But as far as, are you talking about kind of like doing it at home on your own?
Well, personally, I've done many different formats, and the only one I wasn't able to do myself properly was film reels.
Okay.
I borrowed a friend's old 8mm projector and used a good camera and captured it that way, but it's not perfectly ideal. So, but I was talking about mainly for like everyone else, so they didn't have to try and go through me, if So
I'm making notes in the Google Doc right now, so I'll drop some resources in there too for further reading.
So there were a couple of questions that came up that are in the chat. One was, since we are Quakers and we often will start an activity with some silence, what do you think about starting an oral history interview with going into silence? That would have meaning for Quakers, but maybe not others.
Oh, are you asking my opinion?
Yeah.
I think that your organization needs to do what works for them, right? So often, people want a right or a wrong way to do things. I think if that is authentic and that's what feels right for your organization, then you should do it.
And there had been a question about what are some good opening questions? Are there some ideas you might have that we could use, particularly when talking with someone wanting to do a full life? Record?
As I said, I think it's always good to start with some version of where and when were you born and raised, right? We heard that in some of the samples we did. Go right back to the beginning. And then time permitting, you can really walk through their childhood and their education and their family dynamics, right? It's going to depend how much time you have and how much you need to cover, whether or not you want to delve that deeply into their childhood or not. And just remember, if you're going all the way back and you tend to spend a lot of time in their childhood, you should have discussed that with them in the beginning, right? So be clear about the dynamics and the scope of the interview in the beginning.
Kathleen, do you want to ask your question about ensuring that the release stays with the record?
Oh, sure. Yeah. This is actually probably, Linda, more for you. What is is there a plan for things like the release forms? Are they going to stay with the monthly meeting office, or are they going to go to the quarterly meeting office? I'm just thinking about records management.
That's a great question, had not come to mind. I guess I had assumed that would stay with the person who did the recording or would stay with the meeting. It might also be that if you're sending a copy or the transcript to one of the Quaker archives, to at least provide them with a copy of it might be helpful.
Okay. Yeah,
think
I would
we're gonna-
highly recommend against having it stay with the individual. As somebody who does a lot of records management.
Yeah, Linda, I would say you should collect them. And if you're going to donate them anywhere else, send a copy, because there can be copies also. The other thing is if you're sending them somewhere else, they may have their own release forms. So you'll just have to kind of keep that in mind. So if you know in advance that you intend to share them with some larger organization, you might want to have a conversation with them in advance about what paperwork they might have.
This is a whole thing I had not even thought about. Considering we'll need to think about it. Before we get too late, I wanted to ask Carlton to just say something about how, for those people who would be willing to share the video and have it posted on the YouTube channel. Carlton, do you want to say a few words about how people should be in touch with you?
Sure. So firstly, my email is Carlton, let's see, I think it's a dot Crispin at South Jersey. I'll put my email in the chat in a moment. Sorry. Yeah, but yeah. So you record it usually via Zoom. That's probably the easiest way for things to be recorded these days. You can use your phone, like people were saying, but you can upload it to something like Google Drive or contact me, and I'll give you a few methods, and send me an email, and I will edit it and get a revised copy back to you. And if there's anything that needs to be changed, I'll make the changes, and we'll be setting it to our YouTube channel. So, was there something else you wanted me to say, Linda? Sorry.
No, I think that's a good start. I also wanted to share with you something that we do at Haddonfield Monthly Meeting, which is not using video and not really, it's related to recording stories. Some years ago, a woman retired and got the idea of getting together other retired women once a month and doing some writing. And so each month we get together, and there'll be 1 or 2 or 3 questions. What's your favorite memory of Christmas growing up as a kid? Was a simple one. And they've gotten much more complicated since then. But what I found was that after 2 or 3 years, I actually had written half of an autobiography. And it was then easy to go back and fill in some other stories and some different pieces that we hadn't really addressed. So I commend that idea. That group called Friendly Writers has become a really core space of community building for our meeting. And what we share within that meeting is all confidential. And each month someone will write something really funny and silly, and someone will tell a story that may move us to tears. Sometimes people write poetry. Sometimes, people do haiku. We've got one person now is doing a lot of haiku, but it's just a very rich way of being together and sharing those stories and pulling out some things that I think are really helpful. So I commend that model to others and encourage you to think about that as well. Are there any other questions people have?
I did have one more question.
Oh, yeah.
I know you talked about this a little bit already, but are there any tips you have for convincing people who are who say they're too nervous to go on camera or be recorded or whatnot? I know in specific terms, there's this one lady at my meeting who is always telling stories, very talkative, very good at it, but she doesn't want to be recorded because she's nervous about that. So, and I know, again, as you said, once they start, they're perfectly willing to continue on. But do you have any tips for getting them to do it in the beginning?
So, as I said, I think explaining to them the value and importance of oral history, talking to them about some of these big national level oral history projects, like the ones we've been looking at, but then showing some examples from people they might know, right, within the community. That really worked for me. A lot of people were reluctant to sit for my 9/11 oral history project, and I did not want to pressure people or, cause trauma in people's lives as this, milestone anniversary came up. But I often found, with, I was going to say law enforcement, but with the survivors, families, everybody, they would hear, oh, so-and-so interviewed. Oh, okay. I'm going to talk to them about how it went. And then they would come back and they would do it, right? So if you can point out to this woman other people she might know who have been interviewed, I think that would be very helpful. And this sounds like a candidate for an audio interview. I know many of you plan to rely on Zoom. You could even tell her she can turn her camera off. You want the narrator to be comfortable. That is paramount. And so you could do it audio only in person, or if it is going to be on Zoom, just tell her she can turn her camera off. And that might take some of the pressure off and you feel less kind of bared to the public that way. So those would just be some tips or thoughts.
I wonder if we could take a minute. Are people getting some ideas about the kinds of interviews you might like to do and topics that you'd like to ask people?
I just wanted to follow up a little bit on Carlton's question. How valuable are audio only interviews? Because I can imagine of the people I'm thinking of, there's one lady, same idea. I don't think that, and I know she's got her own personality and is likely to say, no, I'm not going on camera. How do that, I mean, it's a different conduit though for the use of that. Obviously, it's not going to wind up on YouTube.
You can. I have audio only interviews on YouTube, and we just have the audio playing over a title card. And in the description, we just write audio only interview. As I said, pre-pandemic, when I was forced to start doing a lot of interviews on Zoom, I did audio only all the time. I think it puts the narrators more at ease. So it's just as valuable. It's the story that's important. That's what's important. And think about it. Many researchers are going to want to use the transcript ultimately anyway, where there is no visual. And even some of the national level projects that we looked at don't have, the Holocaust Museum, the 9/11 Museum, the Veterans History Project, they have a mixture of video and audio only interviews. So it's absolutely legitimate. It's whatever logistically is going to make the narrator comfortable at the end of the day. That is the priority in my eyes.
And just as a note for the editing side, I can add, relevant pictures or something over top of the audio if, that's an option too. So, yeah. Linda, answering what you had asked, one of the things that came to mind for interviewing people is I'd like to interview some older Quakers on how Quakerism has changed throughout their lives, providing they've been with Quakerism a long time.
If I can make one content, so I don't know if it was just me, but Carlton was cutting out a little there. And Carlton, that's fine. But my point is, so Zoom interviews can work and they can be fine, but don't totally discount the in-person interviews. If it's somebody you know and somebody it's not difficult for you to actually see in person, remember, the internet cuts out sometimes. And if that happens during your oral history interview, it's fine. It's not the end of the world. But don't totally discount in-person interviews. If it's somebody, it would be relatively easy for you to do one with, because then you don't have the internet issues. And there's something nice about being with somebody in person. So Zoom is fine, but don't totally discount in person if it's not difficult and if both parties feel safe, as we come out of the pandemic doing that.
Are there any questions that haven't been asked yet?
I would just say again that the Google sheet to some additional resources, my contact info is in the chat. Don't hesitate to reach out.
All right, and on behalf of South Jersey Quakers, I want to thank Melissa so much, and thank all of you for joining us. We'll take a little time to put some materials together. Melissa, if it's okay, we'd like to share your slideshow. I don't know if that's appropriate.
Sure.
So we'll get back to you, and we'll let you know when the video is available online in case you want to share that with others in your meetings. Please, over the next week, month, 10 years, please let us know if you actually do some interviews and how they turn out. One of the things that I want to emphasize is that we would really love to have interviews go up on our South Jersey Quakers website, but we certainly understand if that's something you want to keep private just to the family or the meeting. But definitely remember the archives over at Haverford and Swarthmore. That would be a really wonderful place. When I worked at American Friends Service Committee, when something controversial or difficult happened, we'd put it in an envelope and say, open this in 30 years, so that the record was there, but would not be available to people who had lived through it. So there's different ways of providing information and keeping that for the record. So anyway, any questions that come up, please come back to us. The questions you've asked here are things hadn't crossed my mind yet. So I can see there's going to be a lot of interesting things coming up in the next couple of months. So thank you so much, everyone. We really appreciate your participation.
Thanks, Linda.
Thank you, Linda.
Thanks, Melissa.
Thanks for listening, everyone, and go find Oral History in the Mid-Atlantic region on Facebook and Twitter. And I can't wait to hear more about your work. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.